Hello and welcome to episode 5 of Lex Out Loud, a podcast for writers, readers, and all lovers of speculative fiction. I'm your host, Lex Starwalker, and I'm working on my third novel and taking you along with me for the journey. In season 1, I'm exploring world building in depth. The setting is the stage where the story takes place, and characters are shaped by the environment they grow up in and live in. So for me, at least, the setting is the natural starting point for a science fiction novel. So again, welcome to episode 5. Thank you for coming back. If you've been here before, if you're a new listener, welcome to the show. Welcome to Lex Out Loud. If you are a new listener, I do recommend you go back to episode 1 and start at the beginning, because each episode does build on the episode before. But, you do you. Do what you want. But that's what I would recommend. So today I'm going to, again, be talking about world building and giving my progress and kind of where I'm at in my world building, kind of picking up where we left off last time. But before we get into that, there's a couple other things I want to talk about first in regards to some previous topics I covered on the show. So if you remember in episode 2, I talked about my approach to this novel in that I'm starting with the world building. And once I have the setting developed where I want it, I'll then create my main characters. Then once I have my cast of characters, I'll start thinking about what the story is going to be, the conflicts and the plot. And this is just what makes sense to me. And episode 2 goes into the why of that, if you want to hear more about why I'm doing it that way and why that makes sense to me. However, I do want to point out as often as I can that different writers have a lot of different approaches. And I don't want you to think that my way is the only way or even the best way necessarily. That is not what I'm trying to say on this show. It is, however, the best way for me, but it may not be for you. All I can do is share what works for me. So just as an illustration of that, I saw a post on Twitter a week or so ago by a genre author who actually takes a different approach than I do. I wish I could remember her name, but I don't. And Twitter being the way it is, I could not find the post later to figure out who it was so I could tell you who the author was. But she is a published author, unlike myself. She's been published by a publisher and has books out there. And I'm not even sure if she was writing fantasy or science fiction. But she said that she actually starts with the character or the characters, as opposed to starting with the setting like I do. So once she's developed one or more solid characters, then she asks what kind of a world those characters would have grown up in. And then she starts developing the setting. So if you remember in episode 2, I said that to me at least, that approach seems very backward and would actually be much more difficult to do, at least for me. To me, it doesn't make sense at all, frankly, to approach it in that way. But that's me, and that's my approach. And, I should point out that's my approach for this particular project, this particular book. For example, my book, Dawn of Endless Night, which was an urban fantasy and was the second novel I wrote, I actually had very strong ideas for the main characters before I really did anything with the setting at all. So I did take a different approach with that book. However, the setting for that, as it was urban fantasy, was basically modern Earth. So there was a lot less world building involved with that than there is for this. So it might be kind of an apples and oranges comparison there. But anyway, my point is, here is a successful published author who takes a very different approach, almost an opposite approach than what I do. So I just wanted to share that with you to reiterate that there is no, quote, one way. So, please take what I say with a grain of salt. And if my approach doesn't work for you, that's okay. That's fine. I just hope that I can help you find what approach does work for you. And, sometimes it only takes hearing something that doesn't work or won't work for you to realize what would work for you if that makes any sense. I definitely find that's true for me. Sometimes it takes hearing the quote wrong answer for me to realize what the right answer is. I think I drive my wife crazy with that sometimes, because I will ask her if she thinks I should do A, B, or C, and then she'll say, I think you should do A. And just hearing her say she thinks I should do A makes me realize that I don't want to do A. I want to do B. So it can seem very contrarian from her point of view, but at least for me, that's just the way my brain works. Sometimes I might have 2 or 3 options I'm weighing and I'm not sure which way to go. And it just takes someone suggesting one of those for me to realize that, yeah, that's not the thing I want to do. So hopefully that works for other people too. And even if my approach doesn't work for you, maybe at least it will help you kind of dial in what does work for you. The other thing that I wanted to talk about just real briefly at the beginning of the show today is I wanted to say a little bit about space opera. I was going back through some of the previous episodes, and I just want to be clear that I have nothing against space opera. There's nothing wrong with space opera. I don't want you to think that I'm against space opera or I think it's a lesser form of science fiction or anything like that. That is not what I believe at all. I realize that some of my comments that I've made on the show comparing space opera, hard sci-fi, and mundane sci-fi, and my statements about why I'm personally choosing to shoot for mundane sci-fi with this particular project could be taken or could sound like I'm disparaging space opera. And that's not what I meant to say at all. I love space opera. I love Star Trek. I love Star Wars, at least the original trilogy of movies. I enjoy reading space opera. So I definitely don't myself feel that it's an inferior form of science fiction or something I don't like or anything like that at all. Quite the opposite. However, I do feel that most, if not all, quote, mainstream science fiction that most people who aren't big fans of science fiction are aware of is space opera. And I feel that space opera as a subgenre is covered. It's been done. It's being done plenty. And I want to do something different. Also, because most of the sci-fi I've been exposed to in my life has been space opera, I have a real concern that if I did a space opera, it would be too easy for me to steal ideas from various places, maybe without even realizing it. And that what I did would end up being very derivative and just more of the same that plenty of other writers out there are doing. And I don't want that. I want to do something unique, something different, and be as original as I can. And also, I want to stretch myself and I want to challenge myself as a writer. Also, I think mundane science fiction and hard sci-fi can be really cool when it's done well. And I don't think that there are a lot of examples of mundane sci-fi and or hard sci-fi being done terribly well. There are some, but not a lot. So I want to see what I can add to the conversation, so to speak. And I think that there is a market out there, that there are people out there that want the kind of thing that I want to do, and that those people are not being served terribly well right now by what's being done, because so much of it is either space opera or it's hard sci-fi that's really hard sci-fi and loses people because it gets too technical, or perhaps loses people because it's not written terribly well or the characters aren't developed very well. And I am not trying to do hard sci-fi at all, but I am trying to get closer to that, and I am trying to do mundane sci-fi. And I talked about those in a previous episodes about the different subgenres of science fiction. If you want to know more what I mean by those different terms, you can go check that out in the previous episodes. So I am trying to do what I'm doing because I want to take that approach, but at the same time, also focus on character and better writing and better storytelling than we sometimes see with hard sci-fi. So I guess in a way, I'm trying to have my cake and eat it too, or I'm trying to make it possible for the reader to have their cake and eat it too. And maybe that's way too ambitious for my third book. I don't know, but that's what I'm trying to do. Also, another part of this really for me personally is I love learning about this kind of stuff. I love learning about aerospace and astrophysics and technology and futurism and all these kinds of things. And for me personally, one of the huge benefits of being a sci-fi writer is that I get to learn more about all this awesome stuff that I'm super interested in. So for me, the fact that since I'm doing mundane sci-fi, I need to do a lot more research than I would if I were doing a space opera. That's a benefit to me. That's part of why I like it and part of why I'm doing it that way. But I am not trying to disparage space opera or space opera writers or space opera stories or people who enjoy those stories at all, because I am one of you. I am someone who enjoys those stories as well. I'm just personally trying to do something very specific and different from that with this book. And so that's where I'm coming from. So I hope if anybody was offended or annoyed because it sounded like I was bashing on space opera, I hope you're still with the show long enough to hear this so that I can explain that is not what I meant to say. That was not what I was trying to say, but it did. I think it did probably come across that way to some people at least. So I just wanted to touch on that and be a little more clear where I'm coming from. So I want to continue talking about world building today. And I wasn't sure for quite a while what to do with this episode. I do in the future, probably the next episode, maybe the next episode will be on O'Neill cylinders. And there are some other kind of topics like that I want to cover that are more almost kind of technology discussions or something like that. But I just did the episode on space elevators, and I didn't want to do two of those in a row because it's really not what the show is. The show is, I'm not trying to make a show about futurism or science or technology. This is a show about writing. But at the same time, I don't want to be one of those people that throws out a lot of jargon and terms and stuff that you don't know what I'm talking about. That annoys the crap out of me when people do that. And I think maybe subconsciously, but I think a big part of why people do that is so that they can feel smarter than other people. And my purpose here is not to feel smarter than other people. My purpose is to share my experiences and my journey in the hopes that maybe it will encourage other people, maybe it will inspire other writers, and also just to have, frankly, some companionship on what is normally a very solitary journey, which is writing a book, and to not feel like I'm so alone in this universe inside my own head with no one there to share it with me. If that makes any sense at all, which if you've written a lot before, that probably makes sense to you, but maybe, I don't know, maybe not. So that's what I'm trying to do. So I don't want to do a bunch of just episodes like the last episode where I just went on and on about space elevators. But on the other hand, I also don't want to talk about things like, say, O'Neill cylinders, which I myself didn't know what a quote O'Neill cylinder was a couple months ago. I didn't know the term, at least. So I don't want to be one of those people that just throws around terms people don't understand so that I can feel like I'm smarter than you. So I do feel like I should, when I use terms like that, at least explain what they are. And especially when we're talking about these future technologies that don't exist yet, sometimes it takes more than just a sentence or two to really get the concept across. So I do want to do things like that occasionally so we can all be on the same page. And so you don't have to go do a bunch of research just to understand what I'm talking about. But I don't want to give the impression that that's what the show is. So I didn't want to do two of those in a row. So I wasn't sure what to do with this episode. And I finally, I just sat down and just started writing about kind of where I'm at in my process, and that's how this episode came to be. So today I'm just going to kind of update you on what I've been working on for the past few weeks, and kind of where I'm at and where I'm going. And again, this is all world building stuff, all kind of setting stuff right now. So I'm continuing to research how we might, or probably would, settle the solar system once we start expanding beyond just Earth in the future, and what technology we will need to do those things. Because part of what I'm trying to accomplish with this initial world building is not only just establishing kind of what the setting is like and what some of the locations might be where I can have scenes take place, and what things would look like and how I would describe things. But also I want to get a handle on what year is it during this story. Are we talking 50 years in the future, 100 years, 150, 200, 500? At this point, I'm not sure. And I would like to know that, or at least have a ballpark estimate of how far in the future we're talking. And also just to have an idea of what is my palette or my toolbox of technology I have available. I know right off the bat, because I am doing mundane science fiction and I'm not doing space opera. I know there's a lot of things that are off the table. There's no faster than light travel. There's no time travel. There's no free energy, stuff like that. But I want to get a bit more specific so I know, what does the world look like? What does day-to-day life look like? What kind of technology are people just interacting with on their day-to-day life? And how are things the same, and how are things different to life as we know it right now? So I'm still working on this. I'm kind of calling this my timeline, kind of figuring out where in the future are we, what has humanity accomplished, what is yet to be done, and what is kind of the next thing humanity is shooting for, the next goal they're going to try to accomplish. I recently finished the book, The Singularity is Near by Ray Kurzweil. I talked about that in previous episodes. I'll have a link to that in the show notes if you want to check that book out. But he's a futurist, and it's all a book of attempting to predict future technologies and what they'll look like, and kind of when certain things will happen. And probably the last time I talked to you about that book, I was probably very optimistic about just being able to get dates straight from that book, of him saying, oh, we'll have this technology by this year, and we'll have this technology by that year. Unfortunately, it isn't going to help me in that way as much as I'd hoped it would, as far as determining those dates. But it does give me a pretty good idea of the kinds of technologies that will probably develop in the future, and how we might apply those technologies, how we might use them. But there are two big problems with this book and the predictions that he makes when it comes to trying to say how far in the future will these things happen. The first big problem is this book was published 15 years ago in 2005. And the author made predictions in the book in 2005 that should have happened by now. He made predictions for 2010, 2019, things like that. That as of today, recording this, it's the very end of the year 2020. So he, in 2005, made predictions in the book that he said things that would have happened by now that have not happened, especially in the case of some of his predictions in regards to AI, artificial intelligence, and development of that. Things that he predicted would have happened by now, and we're not even close. We're not even that much closer than we were when he wrote the book, I don't think, on some of those things. So right there, that makes a lot of the other stuff suspect, in that the predictions that he's made that should have happened haven't happened. Now, in fairness, I will say one of the reasons I am using him as a resource is he has made a lot of predictions that were fairly accurate in this book and in previous things in the past that he's done. So he is fairly well regarded as far as a futurist and the accuracy. However, he's not 100% or even 90%. I don't know what the percentage would be, but it's not a high enough level of accuracy that I'm just going to take what he says as gospel and go with it. I'm going to make my own decisions. So that's the one problem. The other problem, and this is actually, in my mind, a bigger problem, is he bases a lot of his predictions on a core assumption that he makes that I do not disagree or that I do not agree with. In a nutshell, just to kind of simplify and shorten things, basically, he believes that in the fairly near future, we will develop the technology to be able to copy the human brain or the contents of the human brain and upload it into a computer. So in essence, we would be able to take your consciousness and put it inside a computer, put it inside a robot, a spaceship, an espresso machine, whatever. And Kurzweil at least believes that once we have this ability, once we have this technology and we can do this, which by the way would effectively make you immortal, because once your consciousness is digital, it can be backed up, it can be copied, it can be put in different places. So if you weren't truly immortal, you'd be a hell of a lot closer than we are now. You would not die of old age or disease or anything of like that. So he believes that once we had this technology, once we had this ability, that everyone would do it. Everyone would be completely digital because it's a superior way to be. Because again, there's no aging, there's no disease, there's no death. You don't have to eat, you don't have to go to the bathroom. All these kind of gross aspects of being a human, you don't have to deal with anymore. And you could effectively live forever. You could have much greater capabilities mentally, intellectually, physically, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So in any kind of measurable way, it would be a superior form of existence than being a biological human. So he believes once this is available and it's something that everyone could afford, that everyone would jump on board and do it, and there would be no more biological humans anymore. And so he bases all of his predictions on that assumption that, well, once we get to a certain point, there won't be any more biological humans. And I don't agree with that. I just don't buy it. I feel like he doesn't grasp basic human psychology here. Sure, when this is available and affordable, a lot of people are going to jump on board for all of the obvious reasons. And, maybe they won't do it when they're 20 years old, but as they start getting older and they start having hardships due to wear and tear on their, biological bodies, more and more people would make the change. But I think it's frankly naive to think that everybody would. I think a lot of people wouldn't adopt it. And if you're wondering why I think that, well, think about it. In our world today, in modern society today, we have people today who reject technology as we have it now. I grew up in small town Indiana. We had Mennonite people who refused to use televisions and radios for whatever reason, but as part of their religion or their belief system, they do not use radios. They do not use television. We also in Indiana, we had Amish people who, in addition to those restrictions, they don't even use electricity or automobiles. Even today, we have people who reject technology that's been around for quite a while for whatever reason. So just considering the world that we live in today, considering human nature and how little human nature has changed in the few thousand years of recorded history that we have, I think that no matter how far humanity advances, technologically, morally, socially, intellectually, educationally, if that's a word, no matter how far humanity advances, you are always going to have people who are behind the curve, so to speak, who are not as advanced in those ways as everybody else is. Even if in the next couple decades, we develop the technology to copy our minds into computers, effectively giving us immortality, I'd be willing to bet that you could fast forward hundreds or even 1,000 years into the future, and there would still be people who reject that technology for whatever reason and are biological humans just like we are right now. So any projection of the future that does not account for that is, in my opinion, inherently flawed. And that's what Kurzweil does, is he says, oh, once this technology is available and it's freely available to everyone, everyone's going to jump on board and you won't have biological humans anymore. I don't think that's going to happen. It may never happen. Maybe in 1,000 years, most or all people would be on board, but you may always have, no matter how far in the future you go, you may always have people who reject, the latest things or for whatever reason. So ultimately, I'm going to have to decide for myself how much time needs to pass for us to develop the technology that we're going to need to make my story work. And I'm not quite to the point where I'm ready to do that yet, but I'm getting closer. So although I don't know the exact year yet that my story starts, I do have a pretty good grasp now on how far we've gotten as far as expanding into the solar system and people living in places beyond just the surface of Earth. So at the point the story begins, I think humanity will have at least progressed through milestone 28 of the National Space Society's roadmap to space settlement. And I'll have that linked in the show notes. It's a free PDF you can download, or you can just check out the website. They have it on the web. And I talked about that more in the past as well. But milestone 28 is the development of orbital space settlements. So my rotating cylinder habitats that are a big part of my initial concept for this are what they're talking about here in milestone 28. So we've at least got to be at that point for me to do what I want to do. So I know for sure we're at least as far as milestone 28. So right now I have kind of two basic approaches I'm considering as far as, where exactly we're going to be in our development when the story starts. The first approach I'm considering is that I would confine the story to our own solar system. So in this case, I would probably say that humanity is at the point of milestone 29, which is terraforming, or perhaps just beginning to do so. But I'm thinking I'll have Mars at least partially terraformed at this point. So they're probably at milestone 29. And I may have more things in the solar system terraformed than just Mars, but definitely at the very least, they've begun terraforming Mars, or maybe they've finished it, which I believe, just off the top of my head, I believe estimates for the amount of time it would take to fully terraform Mars, which is to say you wouldn't need a pressure suit or an oxygen mask or anything like that. You could just walk around outside just like you can here on Earth. Estimates for that, I believe, are anywhere from 50 to 500 years for how long that would take. So right there, that gives us some idea. We're talking somewhere between 50 to 500 years in the future, perhaps, just based on that. So that's the first approach. We're just in the solar system and we're at least terraforming Mars, if not maybe a bit beyond that. The second approach I'm considering is going a bit further in the future and having humanity at the point where we're building our first interstellar starship, which would be milestone 30, which is development of interstellar travel and settlement. So right now I'm doing more research into interstellar travel and how that would work and the various possible ways that could be done, and deciding what I want to do with that. And once I've completed that, I should be able to decide whether we're at milestone 29 or milestone 30. And I guess actually there's a third approach I'm considering, which is really just a combination of the other two approaches. So something that I don't think I've actually mentioned on the show that I should definitely mention is that I'm planning to write many stories in this setting. My plan is for all my books to use this setting. So I might not be going quite as in depth with the world building if I were only doing it for one book, although knowing me, I probably would, because I love world building. But since my intention is to write numerous novels and other stories in the setting, I'm okay with taking extra time to lay the groundwork in the beginning, because I'm going to be coming back to this and using this over and over and over through the years. So if my world building efforts seem a bit excessive to you, do keep in mind that I am world building for numerous novels, not just one. And I'm also wanting to do mundane sci-fi. And although I'm not shooting for hard sci-fi, I do want to have as much realism as possible without getting into heavy math and physics or anything like that. So that by definition, I think requires more research than writing a space opera where I could just make more stuff up and not worry so much about the physics and feasibility and math and stuff like that. So in the third kind of combination approach, what I'm thinking is the story would start out in the solar system and I deal with that for the first one or few novels. And then later I would have humanity build its first interstellar starship and tell the story of that in later books. Because I think it's always good to have room to grow in scope to be able to escalate your story as you go forward. So just a quick aside on some terminology here. I've decided to use the term spaceship for an interplanetary ship, a ship that travels around the solar system. I've decided to use the term starship only to refer to interstellar ships, which is to say ships that can travel to other stars, other solar systems. Now, I don't know for sure if this is a distinction that exists anywhere outside of my own mind, but that's how I've decided to approach it. I personally much prefer the term starship. I just like it better. It seems more futuristic and romantic to me, but the term itself, at least to me, references traveling to other stars, starship. You're flying to other stars. I feel like that's what that term says. So I don't really think it's an appropriate term to use for a ship that doesn't have that ability. So again, this may be a distinction that already exists out there and everybody knows about it and it's accepted. I would assume so, but I don't know that for sure. So maybe it's something I came up with, maybe not. I don't know. But that's a distinction I'm going to be making as I write these books. When I say spaceship, I'm talking about a ship that does not have the ability to travel to another star. Where if I say starship, that's a ship that does have the ability to travel to another star. And, you know, as I start writing the books and developing things more, those two ships would have very different propulsion systems. Your starship is going to have a different type of propulsion than your spaceship. So there'll be very obvious differences between the ships as well. Also, your starships will tend to be a lot larger, probably than the spaceships will be. So that's where I'm at as far as the state of the solar system at the beginning of the story. Once I decide which of the two or the three approaches I want to use, I'll then be able to figure out how far in the future we're at. By the way, I'm considering going into the milestones that we're talking about here for settling the solar system in a future episode. I know I'm not really explaining them a whole lot here. And I know I just talked about how I don't want to do that, just talk about things and not explain what I'm talking about. But it's just way too much to go into in this episode. It needs really its own episode to go through those. So if that's something you're interested in, an episode about the milestones, the roadmap to space settlement milestones, please let me know. In the meantime, you can check the show notes for a link to that PDF or that website where you can see all those milestones and what they are. It's called the Roadmap to Space Settlement by the National Space Society. So now that I know how far we've gotten as far as settling the solar system, I have a better idea of the kind of technologies that we'll need to be able to do that. So there are a lot of technologies we'll need, of course, that we don't have right now. But I'm just going to cover the two most advanced technologies that we'll need as once we establish that we have these two technologies, all the other technologies that will be required can be assumed to exist once we have these other two. So the first is the mass production of high quality, pristine graphene, which will be used for the hulls of the space habitats, as well as the cables or tethers of the space elevators, among other things. So I go a bit into graphene in previous episodes, But for more information on graphene, just go to Wikipedia and look up graphene on Wikipedia. I believe I linked to that in previous show notes. And I will link to that article again in these show notes if you want to learn more about what graphene is. So yeah, we're going to need the graphene to make these space habitats I need. And especially, or also if I'm going the interstellar route, we'll need it to build our interstellar starships. And being able to do that, I think, will most likely involve or even require nano construction. So kind of one of the assumed technologies for me that's included with being able to make this perfect graphene is having nanotechnology and nano construction, because without getting too deep into the weeds, making graphene, you have to arrange atoms. You have to be able to create this substance by arranging carbon atoms in a very specific pattern. So to me, it seems like nano construction is probably where we'll need to be able to do that on a large scale, that we'd need to be able to make these huge structures in space. So being able to make this graphene is the first major technology we're going to need. And the second is we'll need efficient nuclear fusion technology. And we're going to need that to provide power in settlements in the outer solar system, where sunlight is too weak for solar power to give you the electricity that you need. And we'll also need fusion to provide propulsion for our ships that are traveling around the solar system. And also, if we have interstellar starships, fusion will help immensely with those as well. Now, the nice thing is, whichever of the three approaches I choose, these two technologies will do it. So it's not going to affect this either way, whether or not I decide to go beyond the solar system. So even if I go the route of having an interstellar starship, that can be done with these technologies. And I don't need anything more advanced than that. And I especially don't need any magic or any, what some people call Clark tech, which is technology that is beyond our current understanding of physics, technology using exotic matter. But anyway, there's all these technologies that may theoretically be possible, but with our current understanding of physics, there's no way we could do it. Things like your warp drives and your hyperdrives and your lightsabers and your transporters and stuff like that. So I don't have need for any of that. I can stay comfortably in the realm of mundane sci-fi, or even hard sci-fi if I wanted to, and be able to do all this stuff, which is awesome because that's what I want to do. So really all that's left is deciding how far exactly we've gotten in this whole process. And then I should be able to make an educated guess as far as how many years in the future that will be. So that's where I'm at now. I still have a bit more research to do, mainly on interstellar travel and colonizing other solar systems, how that would work, things like that, how the ships would be built, what kind of propulsion they would use, things like that. Again, I'm not using any Clark tech, no wormholes or traveling through other dimensions or anything like that, that would require exotic matter or antimatter, things like that. I also have a bit more research to do on nuclear fusion, but then I think I'll have the majority of what I really need at this point, and I can start thinking more about characters. So at this point, I would really like to get some feedback from you as far as where you'd like to see this discussion go next. I have some thoughts for some future episodes, but I'd really like to hear from you what you'd like to hear about, any questions you have, things like that. The more feedback you can give me, the better chance I have of producing content that's going to be interesting and useful to you. So here are a few of the future topics I'm considering. As I said earlier, I think I'll do an episode on the milestones for space settlement. And I can just go through those really quick. I'll have to, because there are 31 milestones. So if I'm going to cover them all in one episode and keep it under an hour, I'll have to go pretty quick. But at least then we can all be on the same page as far as that. And, you know, it'll give you some idea of the kinds of things humanity will have accomplished at the beginning of this story. And like I also said, I want to do an episode on O'Neill cylinders, which are similar to my orbital habitats that I'm going to have. And this episode will probably be fairly similar in approach to the one I did last time about space elevators. I also want to do the episode on Spaceship and Starship weapons and defenses. This is actually a really fascinating topic to me because what I want to do is very different from most of the sci-fi you've probably seen. It's much more realistic for one. And like everything I'm doing, it doesn't involve any magic or Clark tech, which by the way, Clark tech, let me explain that term real quick. So Clark tech comes from the idea from Arthur C. Clarke, who was a science fiction writer, who made the famous statement that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. So when I'm saying Clark tech, I'm talking about stuff that would require new physics to make happen. Things that may be possible or maybe are theoretically possible, but with our current understanding of physics, there's no way we could really do it. Things like creating black holes or creating stable wormholes, warp drive, transporters, time travel, lightsabers, shields like we see in Star Trek and Star Wars, like these energy shields that protect you from everything, that kind of stuff. With our current understanding of physics, none of that stuff is possible, at least not without using, these exotic forms of matter, which are only theoretical and haven't been proven to exist, or we don't know how we would find it or create it, things like that. So pretty much most, if not all of the space combat you've seen in TV and movies, it is using Clark tech. The one example I can think of from recent memory, at least, that doesn't so much is The Expanse. They don't have energy shields on their ships. They're using cannons shooting physical rounds, and they're using missiles and things like that. However, they do have their Epstein drive, which can just continuously accelerate at 1G. And that would be Clark tech. Right now, there's no way you could do that and carry the fuel that you would need, at least not with a rocket like what they use. So that is magical Clark tech. But the rest of the way that the combat works with their ships is pretty realistic. But other than that, off the top of my head, I can't really think of anything, at least anything recent that's at all, mainstream that is, realistic and not using a bunch of this Clark tech. So I think that'll be an interesting discussion, like talking about what does space combat look like without all that stuff. Oh, cloaking devices. That's another big Clark tech one. Another thing that's pretty much impossible. Making a ship invisible in space is impossible for a few different reasons. So yeah, I think that'll be a really interesting discussion. So yeah, with the big exceptions of graphene and fusion, everything I'm doing could be done with technology we have today for the most part. If we just had the will to do it, which is to say, if we were willing to spend the money and the resources required to make it happen. And it would also, some of these things like these huge orbital habitats would most likely require multiple nations working together, numerous nations working together. Like one country like the United States couldn't do it by themselves. And I'm not even sure that we could do it with our economic systems as they stand today. I think we'd need to evolve a bit as far as our systems of economics and government before we could really do something like that. But that's not something I've researched extensively, so not sure. But yeah, and personally, I find that really inspiring. And kind of to bring things back around to my little discussion at the very beginning of this episode about space opera, I'm hoping that this thing I'm writing now is going to inspire the people who read it. I really do. And I might even do an episode on this because this is something, it just hit me this week, I think. I only just saw this as entertainment, which it is, right? But it could be more. If I can show a vision of the future that is realistic and just over the horizon, that may inspire people who want to see that vision of the future become a reality. I mean, sure, things like Star Wars or Star Trek are cool and they can be inspiring in their way, but I think they lack a certain impact because to a large degree, they're fantasy. And they definitely don't seem like something that's possible. They feel like magic. They feel like fantasy. You watch Star Trek, or at least me, when I watch Star Trek, when you watch Star Trek, you don't feel like you're watching, like this is a reality that could exist in the near future or even in 1,000 years, because there is so much of this Clark tech and this magical stuff. It doesn't seem realistic. And so, although it can be inspiring to some degree, I don't think it's as inspiring as seeing something and realizing, we could have this tomorrow. This awesome thing I'm seeing, this could be a reality tomorrow if we just decided to make it happen. It's not impossible. It's not magical. We don't need hundreds of years of learning new physics to make it possible. We could do it today if we wanted to, if enough people wanted to. And yeah, I feel like I could do a whole episode on how Star Trek would actually make a lot more sense and be a lot more realistic if it were set thousands of years in the future, as opposed to a few hundred or a couple hundred, whatever it is, as it uses so much Clark tech, warp drive, transporters, subspace radio, subspace, time travel back in time, inertial dampeners, artificial gravity, the way they have artificial gravity. That's another one. So to me, at least, seeing something that would be actually possible within maybe only a couple or a few generations is much more compelling and inspiring than seeing something that's just make-believe. And I hope and I believe that I'm not alone in that. So I really hope if I can do what I'm trying to do and if I can do it well, that maybe it'll inspire people. Maybe it will get people excited about the future instead of, dreading it. So that's pretty much what I've come up with as far as the world building topics that I want to talk about in the future, as well as, of course, continuing to share my progress as I go. So if there's anything else world building related or just writing related or sci-fi related or anything that you think would be at all relevant to this show that you'd like me to talk about, please let me know. I'd really like to hear from you. You can email me at lexoutloudpodcast@gmail.com. I have a voicemail you can find and call at 951-465-5391. Again, that's 951-465-5391. It's just voicemail. It goes straight to voicemail. No one's going to answer. You don't have to talk to a human. You can just give your thoughts, and you might hear them on the show if you leave me a voicemail. Also, you can join our community on Discord. You can find links to that in the show notes at starwalkerstudios.com/LOL. You do need to be a $5 or higher patron to get access to the Discord. And as well, you will get access to a private RSS feed where you get the new episodes as soon as I produce them. So I produce these episodes ahead of time. So as a patron, you will get access to episodes days, weeks, or even months before everybody else. And yeah, we have our own little community on Discord where you can connect with myself and other listeners and other writers. So yeah, just trying to give a thanks to those of you that actually support the show and what I'm doing here. So yeah, you can find links to the Patreon, the Discord on the show notes. Also, I'll have those links for resources I mentioned in this episode. You can find that all at starwalkerstudios.com/LOL. All right, so that wraps it up for episode 5. Thank you so much for joining me today. And I really hope I hear from you, even if it's just to say hi. Let me know what you're working on. If you're writing something, I'd love to hear about it. If you have any questions, or if you have tips for other listeners, if on one of these discussions you think I missed something, if there's something I should have mentioned or another tip I could have given, let me know and I will happily share that with the listeners. So thank you again. I'll see you again next time for episode 6. And until then, keep writing.